think I may have mentioned previous time that when I was younger, I worked at a video store, which was good and bad. You know, it was a fun job. Pay was okay. I mean, it wasn't amazing, but it was okay. But it didn't help me develop a real strong work ethic. I'll say that because a lot of times it was just sitting back watching movies. I mean, there's other things I probably could have done, but a lot of times no one's in the store and a movie's on, and it's just easy to sit there and watch a movie. So that wasn't great. But one of the good side or benefits of it was that pretty much anytime I wanted, I could get a free video when I wasn't working. And I'd finish my shift and come home, and there'd just be all kinds of movies that I could choose from. Again, some maybe better than others, but it was a real benefit. Like, even if I wasn't working a shift, I could just go in, and as long as it wasn't the number one title that week, I could probably grab any movie I wanted to and take it and be the entertainment for the night for my friends. It wasn't until after I left the store, left that job, that I realized what a benefit that was, because then I had to go to the video store and actually pay for the movies. I still wanted to watch them, but I started having to pay for them. We tend to take things for granted. We don't realize how many things we actually take for granted. There was a few years ago when we were moving back from British Columbia to Ontario. We had Asher was still just a toddler, and we had Abigail was only just a few months old. And our trip took us past Old Faithful. And so we stopped to check out this geyser. I remember seeing it when I was younger, and we thought, well, you know what, we're here, let's go see this thing. And Old Faithful is pretty amazing when you actually think about it. 32,000 liters of boiling water every time it shoots off, up to a height of 185 feet, and it could last for up to 5 minutes. I mean, when you actually stop to think about how, I don't know if you're familiar with Old Faithful, it's this geyser, they call it Old Faithful because it goes off pretty much every 90 minutes. I mean, it's a slight variation in there, but it's not something you can set your watch to, but they know it's going to go off, 17 to 20 times a day, which is amazing. There's a story Philip Yancey tells in a book he wrote called What Surprised Jesus, about a time he went to go see Old Faithful. And they found out it was still going to be 20 minutes until it was expected to go off, and so they went into the restaurant with everyone else, and they waited it out. And when the time came, when it was drawing near, they all got excited, and they went out and they watched this thing happen, and the geyser goes off. But Philip Yancey noticed something. He noticed that all the people who worked at the hotel, at the restaurant, didn't pay any attention at all. Their job was to go fill the glasses, but even after that was done, this geyser's going off, this amazing thing that is like, for some people, a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and they're just ignoring it. Even if they didn't have a chore at the moment, they just ignored it because they've seen it so many times. I mean, it happens all the time, 17, 20 times a day after day after day, month after month after month. And when you are so used to it, you just become numb to it. You just ignore it. It's not exciting anymore. What are you doing right now? You're not even thinking about it, but every single one of us is breathing. Now you're thinking about it. You go through your entire life almost never thinking about the breath you take. And we see all these leaves around here. And actually, I found out that we give too much credit to leaves for the oxygen we get. We think it's all about these trees that they suck up our CO2, this poison, and they give us back the oxygen, when really it's more plankton. I think 70% of the world's oxygen comes from plankton in the ocean. So hashtag fairness for plankton or something like that. We don't even think about it. God has faithfully made leaves and ocean plankton and everything else that gives us oxygen, and we rarely ever give it a second thought. He gave us bodies that work without us having to think about it. Do any of you think about making your heart beat? It just happens. Again and again and again, day after day after day, until one day it doesn't, but we won't think about that. We don't notice faithfulness. We ignore it. It's kind of, okay, normally it's like we don't notice the sound booth. Let's give a moment to appreciate our sound person. Like when we're sitting in the sanctuary, the only time you notice the only time you think about who's in the sound booth is when they forget to hit the slide thing to move forward. And then you're like, what's the deal? Like, and everyone starts looking back. Or if there's some feedback and then everyone kind of looks back, oh, there's someone in the sound booth who's there every week, and we don't appreciate it because we don't think about it, because the faithfulness causes us to ignore it. It's only when something goes wrong that we notice it. The same thing is true with God. We rest so completely in God's faithfulness that our rest becomes apathy. We just cease to care about it. We cease to think about it. Like those people who are witnessing the amazing old faithful geyser, they become numb to it. So we need to learn how to react to God's faithfulness, not with apathy, but with adoration. We need to learn how to react to God's faithfulness, not with indifference, but with imitation. We're doing a series called The Holy Wild, and it's based on my favorite book. Author is Mark Buchanan. He's actually an Alliance professor. I didn't know that when I first became a fan of him. But he wrote this book about learning to trust in the character of God. So I said last week, when you think of God, what do you think of? Like, what do we mean when we say God? And when you think of yourself, what is it that makes you you? And it's basically these parts of our character that define who we are. And so we're learning about God as he really is. Not the kind of God that we want him to be, not the genie in the bottle, not some God we can put in a box, but this God who is completely wild. I said last week, talking about C.S. Lewis, he's not safe, but he's good. He's wild, but we can trust in his goodness. This series is about learning who God is and discovering if we can trust him. So last week we talked about God's goodness. This week we're going to talk about God's faithfulness. And we're going to look at a passage. It hasn't been that long since we studied it, but we're going to look at Genesis chapter 15. And Genesis 15 verse 1 starts with the word sometime later. So whenever I see that, I'm always curious, well, what happened the chapter before? So keep in mind, when you read the Bible, when it was written, there weren't chapters and verses. We put those in to help us, to track our way through it, because it's a lot easier than just saying, halfway through this book of Genesis and trying to find your spot. But the story flows from one thing to another. And so what happened sometime before Genesis 15? Well, the history here is that Abraham was called by God and called to go to a place where, he said, I will show you. So it's a huge step of faith, and he took with him his nephew Lot. And at some point, Lot and Abraham separated, and Lot went towards the city, and Abraham went towards the other way. And Lot fell in with some people, maybe he probably shouldn't have fallen in with, and Lot got himself in trouble, and he got himself captured. And so Abraham has to go and rescue Lot. And so he goes in and he fights this battle to rescue his nephew. And then chapter 14 continues, and from the spoils of this war, he gives a gift to this priest king named Melchizedek. Now again, this is a lot of stuff that doesn't really apply too much to what we're talking about today, but just to give you some backstory. Melchizedek is this mysterious figure that sort of enters the picture and then disappears, but he sort of represents God in the picture. It's this character who we don't know has no beginning, no end that we know of in the story, and so the writer of Hebrews used him to sort of say that's kind of like God. It's this character who's a priest and a king, so it's kind of like Jesus. And so Abraham gives a blessing gives a gift to him and receives a blessing from him. That's sort of where we get the idea of a tithe from. He gave 10% of everything he earned. Now, the rest of it, he actually refused to take as the spoils of war for himself. He gave that back to the king of Sodom, because he said, I don't want anyone to say that they made me rich. I only want God to be able to say that he's the one who made me rich, nobody else. And so we come to Genesis chapter 15, and Abraham's just been in a battle. He's just given away a bunch of money and received nothing in return, or so it would seem. And so we get to verse 1, and it says, sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abraham in a vision and said to him, do not be afraid, Abraham, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great. So do not be afraid. You've just fought a battle, and you may be fearing repercussion, that they're going to come back and get you, but don't be afraid, because I'm going to protect you. And, you've just given away this blessing, but I'm going to reward you, and your reward is going to be great. and you've refused the reward from the king of Sodom because you don't want anybody to reward you except for me, and I'm going to do that, and your reward will be great. But then Abraham gets very real with God. And he says, "Oh, sovereign Lord, you are good, and all your blessings, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son?" See, Abraham at this point is quite old. He's called to this land, to inherit this land, and his offspring is going to inherit the land, and there's going to be a blessing through him, but he doesn't have a son. And he's probably getting to the point where you'd think, he's too old to have a son. And so God says, I'm going to give you this great reward. And Abraham says, well, what's the point? I mean, thank you. I don't mean to be rude, but what's the point? I don't even have a son. Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You've given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. It's kind of like Abraham's just resigned himself to this and says, I appreciate the blessing you've given me, but you might as well give it to this other guy because that's who it's going to go to in the end anyway. And the Lord said to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." This isn't going to be some kind of metaphorical thing. He's going to be of your flesh and blood. He's going to be yours. Then the Lord took Abraham outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can." Which you can't. Have you ever looked up at the starry sky and tried to count them? It's impossible. That's how many descendants you will have. So Abraham at this point has no children, and God's telling him, not only are you going to have, a child, but the number of descendants you're going to have are going to be beyond measure, beyond count. You will not be able to count them all. And this part's amazing. Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Now, not because of anything he did. Abraham hasn't done anything at this point. He simply believed God. And that's where we take this idea that, that our salvation is through faith alone. Not of your works, not so anyone can boast. It is simply believing that God is going to do what he said he's going to do, which is save us through his son Jesus. But it's interesting because Abraham believed the Lord, and we'll come back to that in a second. He said, "Then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. But Abraham replied, O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that we will actually possess it?" Which is a strange response for somebody who just, we're told, believe the Lord. There's a passage in the New Testament where someone comes to Jesus and says, "I believe, help my unbelief." And it's, again, this very real experience, like, I believe you, and yet I struggle with my faith at the same time. I want to put my faith in you, but I do, but at the same time, there's parts of me that just struggle with it. So Abraham's saying, I believe you, at the same time, how can I be sure? How can I be sure that I will actually possess this land that you've called me from Babylon, the Ur of the Chaldeans, all this way to inherit this land, and I don't have it yet. How can I be sure? And then God shows what he's all about in this next part, starting in verse 9. He says, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." Which sounds like the weirdest shopping list ever. But it made total sense to Abraham. And we'll see what this is about in a moment. So Abraham presented all these to him and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Just killed them and laid them out. Which, again, sounds so strange to us. Like, what is going on here? Why would you kill all these animals and just lay them out? He lays them out in a sense like a corridor. Like a pathway between them. Some vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abraham chased them away. Which, again, I love that. Because if you're writing some fake story, you wouldn't include that. Right? That'd be part of the story. The editor would say, take that out. That doesn't need to be in there. But here we see this actual reality of something that's happening right down to the dirty details. Warts and all. Vultures came down. Abraham had to chase them off. I love this picture. It's so silly in a sense. Here's this solemn thing that's about to happen, and then Abraham's sitting there, chasing these vultures around with some kind of stick. It shows the reality of the whole thing. And as the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came down over him. Then the Lord said to Abram, "You can be sure." I'm going to answer your question. How can you be sure? You can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they'll be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. To which Abraham might have said, "That's not really what I was asking. This doesn't sound so good. Can I get out of bargain somehow because this isn't really what I want. But here's the good news. I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. As for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sin of the Amorites did not yet warrant their destruction. God is basically just laying it out for him, saying, this is what's going to happen. Yeah, there's going to be some difficult times in your descendants' future, but I'm in charge, I'm in control, I am faithful, everything's going to work out the way I eventually plan it to happen. After the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses. Again, coming from a 21st century world, we're thinking, what is this all about? Now, if you've been in this church for any period of time, you know probably what this is about because we've talked about this. Abraham lays out these animals. The birds come down. He chases them off. But the idea behind this is that if you were going to make a covenant in that day, you would kill the animals, you would lay them out, and then you would walk between them with the person who you were making the covenant with. And so you'd walk side by side, and you would repeat the covenant to each other. And so let's say you're making a truce with somebody. Say, I will not go to war with you. You kill the animals, you lay them out, you walk through, and you say, I will not go to war with you. And you're basically saying, if I break my word, then I am agreeing that I will be like these animals. I'm welcoming death on myself to be torn in half, bloody, messy horribleness onto myself if I break this covenant. And you're saying the same thing. So we walk together and we make this agreement that this is what we deserve if we break the covenant. But what's interesting about this passage is that Abraham doesn't walk through the covenant. Abraham doesn't walk through the carcasses. Abraham is part of this covenant that he doesn't make any promises to be a part of. So the Lord made a covenant with Abraham that day. So the smoking fire pot, the flaming torch, a book later, a few chapters later, we're going to see God representing himself as a pillar of smoke and a pillar of fire. And so the smoking fire pot, the flaming torch, for whatever reason, God has chosen this way to represent himself as he's taking part in this covenant. But he walks through it alone. So the Lord made a covenant with Abraham that day and said, I have given this land to your descendants all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. God is saying, how do you know that you're going to inherit this land? Because I am making this promise to you. Not because of what you are going to do. Again, Abraham believed God and God credited to him as righteousness, not because of what he had done, simply because of his faith. God is saying, I'm going to do this not because of what you're able to do, but because I am saying so, because of my faithfulness. The author of Hebrews talks about this. Chapter 6, verses 13 to 20. He says, for example, there was God's promise to Abraham. Since there was no one greater to swear by, God took an oath in his own name, saying, I will certainly bless you, and I will multiply your descendants beyond number. Then Abraham waited patiently, and he received what God had promised. This is now, in the future, looking back on this. From sort of the past for us, the future for Abraham. Now, when people take an oath, they call on someone greater than themselves to hold them to it. And without any question, that oath is binding. God also bound himself with an oath, so that those who received the promise could be perfectly sure that he would never change his mind. So God has given both his promise and his oath. These two things are unchangeable, because it is impossible for God to lie. Therefore, we who have fled to him for refuge can have great confidence as we hold on to the hope that lies before us. This hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. Jesus has already gone in there for us. He has become our eternal high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Again, going back to this mysterious figure who represents God. Abraham asks, how can I know? How can I be certain that I'm going to inherit this land? And God says, I'm going to show you. I will promise by myself. I'll swear by myself because there's no one greater than me. I will show you who I am, and I will be faithful to you. God is true to himself. It says here that he could never break his oath. These two things are unchangeable. It is impossible for God to lie. So if God says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. If God makes a promise, he's going to make sure that promise comes true. God is true to himself. And I don't know if you've noticed or not, but that's become a cultural model for us. You look at the 21st century world and you hear people saying, you got to be true to yourself. Just be true to yourself. And I have to say, it's great when God says that. It's horrible for you and me to say that. It's really bad advice for us to make that our mindset. Just be true to yourself. Because the Bible tells us that's not a good idea. Jeremiah 7:9 says, "The human heart is the most deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. Who really knows how bad it is?" How many evil people in the world have just been true to themselves? How many child molesters have just been true to themselves? You can't judge them. They're just being true to themselves. It doesn't work for us because we are desperately wicked. I don't want to live my life being true to myself. I want to learn to surrender my evil heart to the perfect will of the Holy Spirit and follow the way, the truth, and the life. I don't want to be true to myself. I want to be true to the ultimate truth of God. God made this covenant dependent on himself because he knows that if it were up to you and me, there would be no hope. But our hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls named Jesus. That's what the author of Hebrews is telling us. So we need to learn how to react to God's faithfulness, not with apathy, but with adoration. Not with indifference, but with imitation. Let's learn to recognize more of the ways God is faithful. Let's adopt an attitude of gratitude, as I've heard it said. Let's go through life recognizing that God made leaves for us. God made plankton. More of it. God gave us lungs to breathe it in. God gave us husbands and wives and children. God has given us so much, and it's easy for us to ignore it. It's easy for us to just be apathetic. It's easy for us to just say, this amazing geyser's going off, but I've seen it so much I don't care. But let's not be like that. Let's learn to recognize more of the ways God is faithful. Live with gratitude for everything he's done, starting with worship of his Son who laid down his life for us. And let's learn to be more like him. Let's not be true to ourselves, but choose to surrender every part of ourselves to God's word and spirit. I'm going to ask our prayer team to come up and lead us.